Well, good afternoon, friends. Welcome to another episode of the Baltimore Presbytery Podcast. I'm excited once again to have a great conversation partner here with us for this episode. I'm excited because this is one of my good friends, and she is such a wonderful spirit and soul and a voice in this presbytery. And I'm excited for those who haven't gotten to listen or hear McKenna Lewellen talk. You're going to get to meet her and listen to her today. And so, man, this is just going to be so much fun. I'm excited. So, McKenna, how are you?
I'm good.
Oh, it's so good to see you. How have you been?
I think that depends on the timestamp. Today's great.
Totally. I totally get that.
Yeah, I think along with many of our presbytery colleagues / people around the country, are hitting a wall in the pandemic, but I'm feeling hopeful because the summer at the center is really active and exciting and full of young people that are just living a different pace of life than I am. And so,
yeah, no kidding.
yeah, and a lot of the work that we're getting to do this summer is going to be food and environmental justice stuff, which means that there's like a beginning where there's a field of weeds and an end where there's not, and that's just really lovely.
That's awesome.
I get to be with a bunch of kids encountering their first dead rat, so that's always good. And like the little things.
Do you guarantee the dead rat being there?
I don't, but Baltimore City does. Yeah, you get weeds growing up to like 3 feet tall, and you get a weed whacker in there, and then it hits a dead rat. Nothing better. So yeah, so awesome. I'm good. The sun is out, things are blooming. The rain is washing some pollen out of the sky. I'm getting to talk to a lot of my colleagues. So, and I am going to make enchiladas later. So I'm feeling good.
Oh, yes. Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, for those that don't know you, can I do a little introduction, a little bio, if that's all right?
Yeah.
All right. So McKenna Lewellen is the assistant director of the Center Baltimore, in which the Center Baltimore is a ministry within Baltimore Presbytery that equips churches and church members to better engage with the greater community, not only just outside their doors, but the greater community. Which and the center is a ministry that's near and dear to my heart, as I've gotten to serve on the steering committee here recently, and so I've gotten to know McKenna through our time and work there. McKenna has served the center since 2017, and I get the honor to share with everyone that you will soon be ordained. And right now, at the time of this recording, it's only about 2 Sundays, or not this Sunday, but the following Sunday. So that's not far away. How exciting and how honored we are that you're going to be ordained with us and in this presbytery. How awesome.
So good.
Yeah. And so before coming to Baltimore, McKenna, you preached and taught in congregations in Memphis and in Boston, and you hold degrees from Rhodes College and Boston University. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Can't say nice. So, no introduction is ever really fully encompassing. Is there anything else what's a random fact that somebody would like to know about you?
I actually saw somebody the other day on Twitter ask everybody for their most boring fact about themselves, which is my new favorite question.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, but I also don't have a good answer to it. I think the most boring fact about me is that I have been a diehard Chaco wearer since 2010.
Oh, yes.
The brand of many in my family. With my lesbian gateway shoe.
That's awesome.
Yeah, but I still wear them. And leave every summer with a thorough Chaco tan after being outside that much. Yeah, so I've got the double strap now, so I have an even stupider tan.
I love it. That's hysterical.
And then I think the only other thing is that I, in sort of both of those degrees that I hold, but especially from Boston, really got to specialize in theologies of the body in the 20th and 21st century. So
that's so cool.
Like not theology that somebody wrote in a system to like fit into doctrine or orthodox needs or the church's needs, but theology that comes from experience, from communities, from people's bodies. And so mostly, I mean, that's like a ton of different theologies now, but it didn't used to be. So now, so I really got to dig in on feminist theology, womanist theology, which is theology by Black women who were carving space out for themselves in the midst of sort of second wave feminists who are mostly white, and Black liberation theologians, which were mostly men.
Nice.
And then trauma and theology, which is sort of a newer field. And then finally in disability theology, which sort of got to round out and like bring in all of those things. So I get to talk about disability, but I also get to talk about gender, race, LGBTQ things, about trauma, obviously, but also about like resilience and creativity. And it's so that was my academic experience and what I was teaching in churches.
That's
and
incredible.
What really brought me to Baltimore.
Well, and that's so incredible that you have such a wide, diverse, perspective. One of the things that I look back on and I think of in my seminary education is, man, I was exposed to so many different theologies that I do. I didn't realize that most of us, a lot of us that grow up in the church and or are let's say impacted by the church are really only given a certain theology, a singular theology or very little of other theologies. And so for me, in my experience going to seminary, it opened up a new world of all kinds of theologies. And it seems like that's what your experience and your what you got to take out of it. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. And I got lucky because I started early. I had this absolutely rad advisor in undergrad. She's actually going to preach at my ordination.
Oh, cool.
Named Kendra Holtz. And she is this tiny little white lady who can command a room like you wouldn't believe. And she believed really, she believed, and this was like 2000, this is before it was cute to talk about racism in the church. So like 2010, I roll into one of her classes and we're talking about eco-justice in my intro to Bible class. I'm like, what? and I kind of stuck with it, and without realizing it, she had started shaping me into a little feminist.
That's great.
And I didn't know that's what was happening. Until I did a semester in Scotland, which is like very traditional in its theological education. And I roll into a classroom there with this Oxford educated lecturer. And we started having a fight about the Trinity, because of course we did. And my life has not changed that much. And I cited Macrina, who is the younger sister of Gregory of Nyssa, and he wrote a thing about her to talk about Trinitarian theology being communal and whatever. And that my lecturer's view of the Trinitarian economy of salvation was like, this is for individuals. And I was like, that doesn't make sense. The Trinity is a community. Anyway, we started fighting about it. And I talked about Macrina, and he said, Miss Lewellen, you will please only reference real theologians in my class. Leave your women outside.
Oh my goodness.
And in that, I left class just raging. And I walked around and I thought, am I a feminist? And I emailed Kendra that night and I said, this is what just happened. And I am absolutely dying. And I think you made me a feminist. She's like, yeah, what did you think? It's been 2.5 years. Anyway.
That's
so
awesome.
I sort of got started early on the idea that that all theology is autobiographical, that when we write about God and the world, we're telling something about ourselves, even if we don't explicitly say it. and that all theology comes with this sort of implicit mandatory preface, and that people who were writing theologies of the body had started making those implicit prefaces explicit and saying, wow, this belongs in theological discourse.
Absolutely.
And so autobiographical material, stories about our lives, all of that becomes deeply theological. And so when I was choosing a divinity school, I wanted to keep working on those questions. I went in with a pretty good background on womanist and feminist theology, and
it sounds like it.
Dipping my toes in the waters of other things. And BU felt like the right place to do that, but also like, become reformed with weird people and not like do the thing, like be Presbyterian, but not sort of be beholden to a process that was asking me to take particular classes. I could kind of go under the radar. And that has ended up being like, it made all the difference, because I took every weird class except for one that I wanted to take. And they have prepared me for a kind of ministry that I think is about to become really important, and was accelerated in its importance during the pandemic. And is with people who don't really like the church, or even with people who are in the church who don't like the church.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so I'm really grateful to have had that experience. And it helps. I think it helps me. Well, I say this like 2 weeks out from actually having this title, but I think it helps make me a better pastor, because I'm not interested in making sure everybody has the statement of belief memorized. I want them to understand it. I want them to understand who wrote it. I want them to articulate, with the tools our tradition gives us, something that makes sense for their world.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think like helping people become little theologians is like my favorite thing in the world.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So from a personal, selfish perspective, did you ever look into or study any mujerista theology? I imagine you did. I find what you've said very interesting, and I agree wholeheartedly. Theology is a reflection, and at least the theologies that we claim and espouse are reflections of who we are and our own personal theologies and experiences. And I recently came across I shared this recently with you, Brown Theology book, and it resonates with me, speaking of my Mexican American heritage and all that kind of stuff. And so what you're saying is that's part of me and part of who I am, so therefore it is a reflection of me. So I resonate with that.
And I like, it always has been. We just like, it got covered over because it felt embarrassing to admit.
That's right. Like,
the only way, and this is, don't tell the CPM, but the way that I came to love Calvin wasn't because I loved what he was saying. It was because I understood what he was saying as coming out of a place of like profound anxiety. Like he was just this little anxiety bunny who got thrown into a position of power because he was smart, and he wanted the world to make sense, and he needed it to be like he needed to carry it around in a 2-volume set. And like if you start reading
really big Calvin, volumes, but
if you start reading Calvin and you just read him and you don't know anything about him, you're like, oh man, what a nerd. And then you get to double predestination, you're like, dude, what a jerk. But if you know that he is a person moving around the world that is like constantly like recreating itself, and like boundaries are being redrawn and wars are being fought, and like theologies are being changed, and power is changing, and like who has it is changing, and he's trying to manage a city somehow. And like if you know that about him, And, you know, he's like a weirdo workaholic. Like he died because he had a cold and he wouldn't rest. And he coughed so hard during like a 3-hour sermon that something like burst in his lung and he got pneumonia and he died, dummy. So like, you know, like if you know that about him and then you read about double predestination, you're like, oh, you're a man who just like needs assurances. Like you need to be sure of something, and that something is that like God is in control of everything. Like I have to, like, in order to move around the world as an anxious person, I have to believe that God's in control of everything. And the logical end of that is that God's in control of what happens after we die.
Absolutely.
And that's just like so much more palatable.
Well, like, and it highlights, you make a great point, because it highlights how so many people and you know, myself up to a certain age and a certain, you know, education level, I was in that same boat, that we're only presented a very limited version. Even those of us who grew up Presbyterian were, you know, hey, Calvin, but tulip. You get this, tulip. You get that slice, that sliver of it, and you don't get context.
No.
Which, you know, and that's the thing.
Yeah. Oh, no. And theologians are some of the weirdest people that have ever lived. Like, I cannot believe we don't know more about them. Karl Barth, like patron saint of Presbyterian theology, if we had one, and of Princeton, is buried with his wife and his secretary. They're all buried together.
Oh my goodness.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
And she wrote like all the footnotes for all of his books, for his giant, whatever. Paul Tillich, crazy dude, open marriage, moves to New York City, just sleeps his way through Harlem. Like, oh my gosh, you know, and we're reading these books like they have created doctrine for us. It's like, these dudes were messed up and they wrote really interesting things. And like, I have to know about them to understand their theology. You know, like Tillich was a chaplain in World War I in the trenches, and he came back with PTSD. Like he came back profoundly disabled and came back to find out that his wife had married his best friend or cheated on him with his best friend, and that she was pregnant. So he got a divorce. So like his life is nuts, right? But his whole theology is rooted in this idea of estrangement and reconciliation. Right. And it's like estrangement from self, from others, from God, and then like being remembered together. So, you know, like knowing these stories and understanding the stories that are foundational to our own being and to our own selves is deeply theological work. And
you know, it makes me think of, you know, so many of us have, you know, when we ask the question, who is God, and you know, to anybody, most of the time, the vast majority of time, it is impacted. It is created based on our experience of who, you know, what our like family experiences are, right? So if you know, if we ask someone who, you know, what characteristics does God have for you, or do you most relate with, right? If you know, quite often, if you have a traditional, you know, loving family, you know, as I do, you know, I have this loving parent figure. But there are people who, you know, and you think of growing up in Texas, we hear, you know, Father God, we, you know, the very masculine, you know, attributed, you know, gender, you know, role to God. But that same gender characterization as a loving father may not, you know, resonate with someone who didn't have that similar upbringing or had a terrible, right? So, you know, so much of that theology, our understanding of who God is and what characteristics God, you know, has, are based on our own understandings and our own experiences. And that's what that makes me think of.
Yeah. And I think for a long time, and even still to an extent, in more traditional circles, or just in circles that haven't had access to these conversations, the idea that we are using images from our everyday life and language can be sort of frowned on.
Right.
Because it's like seen as like folk theology and not like real theology. But like the like real Orthodox position came out of somebody's experience too. It just got codified as real because the people who had that experience had more power.
That's right.
And so
that's right.
I think this investigation of ourselves and our culture and our language and our celebration of it is good, because that's what we have, right? Like, I want to speak about God in my own language.
That's right.
You know,
that's
like
right.
I want to talk about God and think about God and access like images and language and ways of relating and all of that, like, and a vision of what God is doing in language that is my home. And so like I can learn other languages, like that's really important too, right? Like that's why I learned a lot about womanist theology, because my corner of the world is just one corner of the world. It's not wrong, it's just one.
That's right.
And so I think there can be a lot of fear about learning these new theologies because they feel really different or uncomfortable or sometimes totally at odds with our corner of the world. But it's also just so beautiful and so fun, because like even in the Bible, right, there's a multitude of ways of thinking and talking about God, because they're all coming from different corners of time and different places and different positions of power within the societies they were in different languages. And so why would we not give ourselves access to that same thing?
Absolutely.
Anyway,
well, and that's what I appreciate. No, that's fantastic. And that's what I appreciate. I was going to say this earlier, that, when I mentioned Brown theology is sort of a new theological construct of helping, Hispanic, Latinx peoples kind of, re-engage the different aspects of our heritage and culture. And so for me, it helps me, think back on my life experiences, my own heritage, and reclaim that. And as you're saying, like, speak to it in a language that makes sense to me. And so understanding these theologies, as new as they may be, they're really not new. It's just we're putting words to them, putting language to it to be able to access it, right?
Yeah. And honestly, like really, it's not new. It's just gained footing in the academy long enough to be published in a book.
Right.
Yeah, like disabled people have had a worldview and spirituality and a theology for a long time, but no one's admitting like visibly disabled people to graduate programs. They're not getting PhDs. PhDs aren't made for certain kinds of bodies and experiences, and the disability community is one of them. But now there are enough scholars that either got admitted and made it through and are publishing, or are made it through and then became disabled and started publishing, that there's becoming because of the publication of different books, a conversation at the level of the academy that's making it into the publishing world, that's getting dispersed out again, instead of just, what's already happening on Twitter.
Or the Academy of Twitter.
Like Twitter's great. I know the church is nervous about it. The church is nervous about a new kind of light bulb, like forget the internet. But and that's fine. Like we all have to be scared of something, I guess. But there's just the community that people have found. Like people reference like Black Twitter all the time. It's real. Like it's real. There are communities formed across class, across geography, across like whatever, you name it, like
culture.
People are having conversations together and forming ways of talking about things on Twitter, and like disability coalitions are being formed there.
That's awesome. So that's certainly one of the beautiful things of social media is the way it's able to connect people as community. Now we know too there's a downside to that, but by and large, when you look specifically at the ways that it can bring people together that might not have normally been able to come together and feel like they have a voice and have a place for their voice. So Black Twitter, there's all kinds of Latinx, Hispanic, all kinds of stuff. So McKenna, you mentioned, disability. That's one of the areas, disability theology, that you can talk about, although clearly you're well versed in so many areas, which is so cool. And I get a kick out of talking with you, because I feel like I learn something new all the time. And so I'm grateful for that. And but disability is one of those theologies that I think, continuing on in the thread that we're talking about, for many people, growing up in the church or thereabouts, aren't exposed to disability theology. Can you talk to us about that? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, so I think that's for a few reasons. I think the first one, I don't even know how I can order these. Of many, one is that we don't really encounter disability in our congregations. We do sort of, but we don't talk about it, or it's an exception to a rule. It's not part of our community. It's something we have to accommodate for one person at a time. So, and it's like a sickness. It's like, oh, so-and-so like is an amputee now, like, but it's whispered. Or, oh, so-and-so is like losing their vision. They need a large print bulletin. Yeah. We have my favorite disability accommodation in churches is like the cutoff pew for the wheelchair.
Oh yeah.
It's like always in the front. I don't sit in the front. Or like they thought to cut out the pew to make room for a wheelchair, but like you have to like go up steps to get into the sanctuary. That just kills me. So and like there's so few sanctuaries that are accessible. Like just think about mobility accessibility, which is a major category of disability. If there's accommodation made or accessibility thought of, it's not a means to an end, it's the end, right? Like accessibility isn't the end. Accessibility is the means to the end of everyone flourishing. And so, but we're not thinking about it like that. We're like, oh, somebody has a wheelchair, now we have to put a thing in. All right, done.
Yeah, that's such a great point.
And just thinking about like the setup of that, right? Like the assumption in our architecture is that only people who are in our congregation, and only some of them, are disabled. No one in leadership is, right? Like there are people who are asked not to join choirs because they can't process in. There are people who like can't preach in a pulpit that's raised. Right? Like even just like the way we do a receiving line, asking a pastor to stand for like 20 minutes is something that some pastors can't do, but like people are weird about them sitting on a stool. When I do that in receiving lines, not even at a church that I pastor, which would be a whole other thing, but when I guest preach, right? And I need to sit down for the receiving line, then like 30% of the people who come through say, "What's wrong with you?"
Oh.
Well, nothing. What's wrong with you? But if I say nothing, they don't believe me. And if I say I have a disability, they go, sorry, and then they run away. So there's a sense of like not knowing what to do about it, a sense of shame around it, and a sort of limited view that disability is something that's bad that happens to us, that's an individual problem for someone to resolve or overcome, and is something that disqualifies you from leadership.
And that's unfair.
Right. And so I think sort of it's honestly like a lack of imagination on the church's part. I think the more people learn about it and get comfortable with it, it could get better. We're also fighting against our own history. The ADA has only been law for 30 years, which is sort of unbelievable to think about.
Yeah, you shared with me a resource, a movie called Crip Camp, that I watched a while back, and now it's blanking. But that was one of the things. My mind is blanking and recalling it. But that was one of the things that kind of took me, threw me for a loop. That it's only within the last 30 years that we've had accessibility.
And there's like 504. There were other laws before that, but they weren't being adhered to. Like they would pass and then no one would enforce them because it's like, whatever.
Right.
And so a lot of the protests that are talked about in that movie are to either like get 504 or to get it enforced. And then finally the ADA rolls around. And the backlash against getting ADA passed was enormous because schools, hospitals, whole cities with their infrastructure are not built for disabled bodies. And so literally the pushback was, it's too expensive. We just can't recreate this. And it's been proven incorrect, right? Like every time you see a sidewalk cut out that like you can like push a stroller over, like that's new. That's post 1990. Like the world did not have those before that. Anytime you see a bus that lifts or goes up and down, that's new. That was not there before 1990 because it didn't have to be. Anytime you see a ramp, 1990. Like these are new things that have happened in our world. And so things are possible. The church is fighting against its own history because the church was one of the biggest opponents of the ADA.
Ugh.
I know, it's like really not good. So, I mean, it makes sense, right? And they were making it as an economic argument. They're like, we have historic buildings we don't want to mess up. But you also bring in, and I'm not saying that the rest of society isn't guilty of this too, but it's like particularly hard in the church. Because you bring in sort of anything post-Reformation, like you've got the Enlightenment, you've got like a deeply white supremacist church growing. The church is like a place where like Nazism and eugenics really grows. And like Nazism and eugenics weren't great for the disability community. You have community outreach and like mission and oh my gosh, what's the word I'm looking for? Benevolent societies run by like rich Protestant ladies who are like creating houses, like whole institutionalizing like systems for people with disabilities to take them out of normal society. And so the church is like missionally, theologically, and physically in its architecture, like not just not set up for disabled people, but is like actively like pulling them out and calling them less than.
And a lot of people don't even realize that has happened, that's the history that we're engaging now, that we're seeing and we're fighting against.
Yeah. And like we talk about the civil rights movement not being that long ago, right? And we like have colorized photos from the 1960s and all of, we're working with white churches and it's like, that was so long ago. It's like, I'm sorry, grandma, you were alive for that. Like,
right.
Like if you're 80, you could have been outside one of those schools yelling at Black kids. Like, don't talk to me about it was a long time ago. When we're talking about disability rights, we're not talking about really like we're talking about my lifetime, like,
right.
And so, and the ADA wasn't perfect. Like it gave sort of minimal access to things and some differences. And the rule isn't like exempting people of anything. It's just like people are required to give a reasonable accommodation is I think the language. But it's not perfect. You have to prove medically that you have a disability if you're in an institution. You have to have an official diagnosis, which is like, I went all the way through school, never going through the disability office. Cause like, just what, like having to get the paperwork for it was expensive. It's like a cost thing.
Yeah.
And then having to like reprove it every year. Like I have a friend who has like a long-term neurological illness and she's just finishing college and she had to go back and prove every semester that she still had this disorder. She's like, I'm going to have it until I die. Why do I have to do this over and over again? Because there's this weird thing about the ADA that like non-disabled people think that the ADA is like free money and housing and healthcare. And it's not, it's me having to prove that I'm disabled so that I can get things that allow me to not do things better, just like to do them at all.
Right. Oh my
And
goodness.
so I don't know, it's just wild. So the church is fighting against its own history. It doesn't know its own history, but it's like right living it out over and over again. And it's exempt from the ADA.
Yeah, that's one of those, when we talked about this the other day, that's one of the things that like, again, I'll plead ignorance here, that I had no idea, didn't even realize that the church doesn't have to and doesn't go out of its way to accommodate. I mean, I know that, but it didn't really sink in until we talked about it. Like, unbelievable.
It's pretty wild. Like, I don't work for a church, I work for a presbytery. It's in a church building. Because of the ministerial exception, and because we are not we don't have to be ADA compliant, there's no, like, they don't legally need to have an elevator that works in that building. And my office is on the 3rd floor. And so if the elevator's broken and people forget to tell me, I show up at work and I can't get to my office sometimes. And so, and if I wanted to sue them because they're not giving me a reasonable accommodation, which would be an office on the 1st floor if they can't fix the elevator, or having an elevator that works, I can't do it because they're not subject to the ADA guidelines.
Oh, geez.
And because they're subject to ministerial exception stuff, where, like, anyway, so that's like a whole other conversation, but it's like bonkers. Churches can decide not to hire me if I'm disabled because of the ministerial exception and not be sued. It's wild, because I think there's still a deep sense in the church and in our country, that disability is a problem, that it's an impediment, and, like, there are a lot of days that I would really rather not have this to deal with. But I also know that, like, I mean, just think about the deaf community. It revolves around a language, right? It's whole own language and grammar structure and, like, everything. And so you have a whole culture and community that's thriving. And they, like, when you have accommodation, when you have ASL translators at a space, they can engage like anybody else. They just need a translator. And same for the, like, blind and, like, hard of seeing community. Like, they just need stuff in Braille. And there's technology now that makes all that possible. The church is just so behind on the tech, like, stuff. And
that's not at all surprising that the church is behind all of that.
No, I mean, like, disabled people know how to navigate the world in creative ways. Like, that's not hard. Like, if there are days when I, like, can't see things as well, I'm going out to, like, lunch or something with a friend, I'll, like, catch a bus or a train. And I could do this a lot easier in Boston than I could here. But, like, and I would have my computer read me the menu beforehand, so I would know what I wanted to order before I got there. Like, we know how to do this stuff, but we're seen as, like, it's seen as a burden in, like, word-centric traditions where there's a lot of reading involved in worship, instead of, like, call and response in worship, where we don't want to spend the extra money for an ASL translator, or where we don't want to have the pulpit on the ground instead of up in the air. Like, it's just, like, really simple things that if we were asking questions like, what kinds of changes could we make to create a context that allows everybody to flourish? Instead of, like, what do we have to do to accommodate this one person?
Yeah, that's such an incredible point right there, to allow everyone to flourish.
Yeah,
but we don't see it that way. And as you mentioned, it's the accommodation. It's kind of the bare minimum that we can do. Right. How can we duct tape this thing together so that we can just keep going, rather than saying no. In what ways can we really allow people to flourish, to be who they have been called to be, or who they are, and allow that, to shine through.
Right. Like, accessible space and accessible communities doesn't mean that you've checked a particular list of things, right? It doesn't mean, okay, I'm accessible because my space is flat and like I have things in Braille and I have big print hymnals and like, it's not a list, it's a perspective. It's like, how can I be open and welcoming, hospitable, and creative, which is like all stuff the church should know how to do, right? Like,
yeah.
And like we claim to like have the when we're talking about churches that are dying and they're like, we need to be hospitable. It's like, great, let's do it. But but that's like, we need to have a visitor parking spot. Dude, no. Like, it's like, how can we continually listen to our community and be a welcoming place and meet the needs of people so that they can participate in ways that help them grow, that challenge them, that they can learn things, and that they can feel a full part of the community without feeling like a burden. When we have accessibility like available to people, it's better for everyone. And it's better for a lot more people than we think because, and this like floors people, the disability community is the largest social minority in the United States. 25% of US adults have a disability. And we live in bodies. Everybody's going to be disabled at some point. I have a friend who calls able-bodied people temporarily non-disabled. Right? Like, like people grow old and it is messy, right? Or like people are clumsy, you're going to break your leg. And like, let me tell you, you don't know where the accessible entrance is until you break your leg. And you're like, why the hell is this by the garbage in the back? Like everybody is temporarily non-disabled. So why would we not create communities for ourselves?
That's right.
The flourish.
And I heard you give a presentation, a talk the other day. And, one of the things that you mentioned, because we're simply, forgive the phrase, but blind to what, disability is. And one example you mentioned is our eyeglasses and contacts. Can you share that example?
Yeah, that's my favorite one to talk to churches about.
Yeah, it's good.
So when we think about disability in the church, we're usually thinking about it because our building and grounds people were like, maybe it's time to put an elevator in because Fran has a walker now. And like, that's great, put an elevator in. But that's not the end, or it shouldn't even be the beginning of the conversation. But, we'll figure that out later. So when I'm talking with a congregation about disability, I'm not talking about mobility aids. I'm talking about that and like this whole slew of things. Like, what does it mean to be accessible as a congregation to people with depression? Like, what does it mean to be accessible as a congregation to people with epilepsy, with autism, with just it goes on and on and on. And my favorite example to give, as you've just mentioned, is that anyone who wears contacts or glasses has a disability. You have a disability. You can't see without those things. And it doesn't feel like you have a disability, though. And you might not identify as being part of the disability community because you have an accommodation. You have a tool of accessibility that makes you not think of yourself as like a problem or as needing something else or as disabled, right? As less abled. Accommodations are that powerful, right? Like when I have what I need to flourish, my disability doesn't get in the way of things. My disability only gets in the way when the structures around me aren't accessible.
That's right.
Yeah. I think my second favorite thing to tell churches is that is shifting from that idea that disability is an individual problem that I have to solve or that the church has to solve out of the goodness of their heart. Because they're not legally required to, is that I am disabled. That's not because there's something wrong with me. In the medical model of disability, it is like there's something wrong that can be fixed. And in some cases, that's true, right? Like there are illnesses that we would really like cures for. There are chronic pain. There are like chronic pain illnesses and whatever that people would like help for.
Yeah.
And like For my condition, like I take medication that really helps me. That's an accessible thing, right? Like an accessibility thing is medication. But
Sure.
like, I'm going to have this forever. I'm not kidding myself. I'm not going to get a cure, but it's also part of who I am. And it doesn't disable me. The world around me does. When I need to use a crutch, I'm not disabled by my legs. I'm disabled by stairs and a lack of an elevator.
And you say that again, because I think that's an important point for people, a distinction people don't often make. You say that again?
Yeah. When I need to use crutches, when I'm having a mobility issue, I'm not disabled by my legs. I am disabled by stairs and lack of an elevator. I can get around. I have a crutch. It's very cute. And I can use it to get around, but it's so hard to get upstairs. And it's really hard when the elevator's not working. I'm disabled by not having a first floor office. I'm disabled by my colleagues' like forgetfulness to call me when the elevator's broken. I'm disabled by policies that say we can't work from home, which our presbytery has been great about. But like generally, as the pandemic is ending right now, people with disabilities have had jobs. They've been able to work from home. It's been amazing. And they're being told they have to come back into work in order to keep their jobs now. And they're like, why? We did this for a whole year and a half and we were productive.
Right.
What the heck? So yeah, I am not disabled by my condition. I am disabled by the way the world meets it, by the architecture around me, by the social expectations of bodies. And so that's not a thing that's on me. It's not a thing that I feel ashamed of when I recognize almost all of the problems that I have are because the world isn't made for my body.
Yeah. And that's such an important distinction because, there's so many of us that I'm sure you've encountered, I've encountered, we know folks that well-meaning as they may be, they don't understand that, what precisely what you said, you're not disabled by what you deal with. You are disabled by the world around you that has these, parameters and challenges where there could be accommodation that would make things, a bit easier and commonplace. I came across something not too long ago. I think I think it was on TikTok of all things. A couple of young guys who I think they're hard of hearing. It was a while back, so I'm having a hard time remembering exactly, but hard of hearing. And they showed a clip where we'll assume a well-meaning person came by and said, I'm going to pray for you that you will receive, sight. And, they come back on to the video and say, well, wait a second. I'm totally okay with who I am. I don't need to be healed as they were. And I think that's an important thing too, because similarly, when people think that, it's an affliction, that I think they're missing the point.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And especially with deaf, hard of hearing, blind, and hard of seeing communities, you're talking about an entire culture, right? In this, if we were talking about depression, there's not necessarily a culture of depression.
Sure.
But you're talking about a community that has its own language, and you say, I hope that God heals you. It's like, screw you, lady. My life is good. I'm disabled by people not having Braille menus. And when I'm not allowed to hire an ASL translator to come with me. Right? My computer can talk to me now. My computer, I can highlight text and it'll read it to me. And I can speak and it'll dictate it. That's bananas. There's plenty of accommodations for me to move around the world just fine. Please go away. And because you're not just talking about an individual person's sense of identity with that particular instance. You're talking about you're saying your culture is invalid. Your culture is,
or in some sense, they're not whole, right? We talk.
Your culture is less than human.
Less than human, right? Right.
And
that person who was deaf, and I'm going to pray for your healing. That somehow, God messed up on that one.
Right.
Right? Like you're less than human, you're subpart. Wait a second, hold on.
Yeah. And I think, and this could be a good place to end, is that there's so much evidence for a different way of thinking about disability in scripture. If we just put on a different set of eyeglasses, right? Like if we bring to scripture our vision of like the kingdom of God is full of like whole, healed, clean bodies. And like, let's just like throw in white there for funsies. Like that's not fun. I don't want that. But like, and we'll find healing stories that justify that, right? Like Jesus walking around and healing people and making them all better. But if we actually put ourselves in the context of Jesus's time and we think about what disability meant then, Jesus does two things. The first is when he encounters people who have been disabled from birth, he reminds people that it's not their fault. He tells them that it's not tied to sin, that it's not shameful, that it wasn't their parents' fault, that it's not like some weird, like hereditary, like your grandparents sin, so now you're screwed sort of thing. Like he goes out of his way to tell people that. And it's really frustrating to people. And I think like we've moved beyond the idea that like the grandparent's sin lives in the child's body sort of thing. But we haven't moved past like individualizing it and making it be shameful. Like we're embarrassed when we see bodies that we perceive as being less than whole. I know like my mom, I was born with a heart condition that's like mostly resolved now. But when I was born, my mom felt like shame about it. And she felt like it was her fault. Like she'd grown a person that wasn't whole. And like, that's not right. That's not on her. That's like deeply speaks to the way that we think about
exactly
bodies. And then the other thing that Jesus does, besides telling people like, screw off, it wasn't his parents' fault, is heal individual people in the context of an empire that injured people, that disabled people on purpose to make examples of them. And so you have a Roman authority that will inflict wounds on people to show publicly, like, so they have now public bodies that witness to the ways that they've rebelled against the empire.
Right.
So you're not looking at someone with an impairment from like work, though that happened too, like carpentry was not easy. And, but you have like public physical marks of rebellion, not of like, I mean, it was supposed to be shameful, but it's like, you know, it's a rebellion. And then you have, you know, the conditions of first century Palestine weren't great for everybody's health. And so you have people who need some medicine that they just like didn't have access to. So it's an accessibility question. Jesus gives access to things people don't have access to because of the way their culture is. And then finally, his way of healing people, he's healing all kinds of people at every level of power, right?
Yeah.
And so he's saying, I don't care about those levels of power. In the kingdom of God, that's collapsed. I'm gonna heal everybody. And the healing of everybody is a witness to everybody being in a community together. But it's also a witness to Jesus saying, in my kingdom, not in this empire, but in my kingdom, Rome has no authority. Slavery has no authority because, right, enslaved people are injured in order to make their work more painful. People who are leading rebellions against the empire are being injured or killed publicly. And so the healing is not, I see you individual person and I have made your individual life better, though that is a nice side effect. His healing is Rome has no authority here. The injuries of Rome do not live in my kingdom.
Yes.
Oh
my gosh, that's
so
great.
Powerful, right? Like,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And such a, go ahead. I'm sorry. I was just saying another perspective that we don't get and we don't see.
Yeah. When you go into it saying like, disability is not about my individual shame. It is not about my individual illness, about my individual like wrongdoing or whatever. It is an empire problem. The world has been structured in a way that is screwing with me. And if it would stop doing it, it would be fine. I'd be fine.
Yeah.
And so, like, you know, like, and so Jesus comes in and says, like, in my kingdom, we're not screwing with this anymore. Right? Like, that's huge. And so there's been lots of theologizing done about like what glory bodies look like. What do resurrected bodies look like? Are they whole and blemished and shiny? Like, I don't know, but Jesus's body was definitely busted post-resurrection, right? Like he put Thomas's hand in a hole in his body. Like he's got a handle on his hip bone. Like I don't know. But once you start to see that is the way, once you start seeing Jesus engaging disability that way, you can look back through scripture and see like there are other places where people are disabled and not healed or cured. Moses has a speech impediment. We roll right past it because he talks still, but actually what we're reading is what Aaron is translating to the people, because one of Moses' excuses, like, I don't want to do it. He's like, I can't speak well. No one will get it. And God's like, shut up here, just take Aaron. and so he does. So Aaron hangs out with Moses all the time and he translates everything so that people will understand what Moses is saying, because Moses is saying what God is saying. And that's important. Right? Like, it's not that there's anything wrong with Moses. It's like, hey, like, I feel like this is really important to get right. Probably it should go through 2 mouths. And everybody seems to like this guy. And so God gives Moses an accommodation.
Right.
Right? Like,
absolutely.
All the way through scripture. Yeah. Anyway.
And yet we never even consider it. We never think, no one ever says, Moses is less than, right? We think of, lepers as being the quintessential, disabled person, people throughout scripture, but we don't say, Moses. McKenna, I know you've got to go and we're running out of time here, but I'm just so thankful to you for your time and for the great conversation. I said this up front, and I think it's true. I think we could keep talking and we could have another episode of this. So maybe, hopefully, if you're willing, we can have another episode.
I'd love it.
We just scratched the surface, I think, on disability in scripture, and then let alone other types of theologies that we could get into. But my friend, thank you so much for your time. I thoroughly enjoyed it. You're such a great voice, and such a fun person. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, this has been an absolute blast. Thank you so much.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you, McKenna. We'll talk later, but hopefully I can get maybe some of your info or some websites, resources. I'll put on an end graphic to connect people, anybody that wants to learn a little bit more, or maybe they can reach out to you and have a conversation themselves. But so we'll connect with that later. But thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it. It was a pleasure and a joy, and certainly my honor. Thank you. Soon to be Reverend McKenna Lewellen.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We'll talk later. Okay.
Sounds good.
All right.